I will now go into the birthday greetings. This week we've only got one birthday greeting for Greg Miller, whose birthday was last Sunday. Happy birthday to Greg. And celebrating their anniversary this week, instead we've got Belinda King, 1 year, David Lewis, 3 years, Brian McDonald, 6, John Higginson and Rob Thomas, 9, Colin Williamson, 23, and Simon Drew, 30. Congratulations to you all. As usual, all important announcements will be shared by our bulletin each week and by the new MailChimp email distribution, and also are available on Facebook and WhatsApp. Just another reminder to all members who have ideas for a lasting physical celebration of our 100th years anniversary in Adelaide to contact past President Frank O'Neill and share them with him, please. There was a note in this week's bulletin, and we might keep that up going forward. I would like to thank you, all the members that have renewed their subscriptions. If you are experiencing any difficulty with renewing your subs or are unable to pay online, please do not hesitate to contact Director of Membership and President nominee Paul Denver. His contact details are in the reminder email that is come, as well as the directory, of course. Also, if you have not received the email, please remember that the email is only a simple reminder. You do not actually need the email to renew your subs. It is a simple matter of logging into the website in the all payments section, and then from there selecting renew membership under the membership menu that will appear once you're logged in. Next week, we are expecting a large attendance for our guest speaker, the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove. His topic will be leadership in challenging times. Please don't forget that because of this, next week meeting requires a very simple registration in Zoom in order to obtain the link and the login details for the meeting. All information is available on the event section of our website. Like we've been doing in the last few weeks, after today's meeting, I will be setting up some breakout rooms. So please stay around if you've got a few more minutes, because they provide a great opportunity to catch up and connect. Lastly, a reminder that I'm recording the meeting, so the meeting will be available online on our social media channels for people that haven't been able to participate and see it live. Enjoy your lunch, whatever you personally selected today, and don't forget that you can still contribute to our community projects by placing a donation in our virtual vaults on our website. I will share the link, as I do generally now that I will hand over to Peter. I will now hand over to our speaker source for today, VP and past President Peter Neal. Just wait.
You may find it easy to select the speaker's view on the top right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see me only for a few moments, but you'll see a lot more of Chris and his work in a minute. I've got nothing in particular to share. I've not been advised anything in particular to share in our Spotlight on Service this week, other than to say our community activities are happening all the time. You will recall that Chris Schacht was our inaugural guest speaker online about, as Adri said, 7 or 8 weeks ago. He made a great impression on many members with his insightful comments about China, an issue, like COVID-19, that seems to be always with us. We woke to news today that an international study has found daily pollution emissions down by as much as 17% globally compared to the same time last year, with the fall in Australia even higher, down as much as 28%. Perhaps the new normal may have some benefits, and we have been truly facing a new world. When organising our first meeting, Chris mentioned a fascinating book he was reading called Empty Planet, which seemingly tipped the whole notion of populate or perish on its head. Chris has undertaken further extensive personal research and is with us to share it today. Thanks, Chris. Over to you.
Thanks, Peter. And I'm coming through. People can hear me?
Yep.
Yes? Yep. Right. Well, look, yes, it was when I prepared for the presentation 6 weeks ago, I was using a lot of internet, Google, and I came across quite accidentally a speech and questions to these two authors who had written a book to publish end of last year called Empty Planet. And what I heard them say on the internet meant I went and got the book, ordered it through Imprint Bookshop, took 3 weeks to arrive. And it's a book, it's only barely over 200 pages in length. And when I read it, it had an impact on me similar, looking back on some other occasional books that have come out of similar length, but have an enormous impact. One of them was the book, The Fate of the Earth, written in the early 80s about the threat of what nuclear war would do to the human population, basically wipe it out. It was a book that had a big impact around the world and helped the whole negotiation about nuclear disarmament. The other book later in that decade was the book called A Brief History of Time by that physicist who only recently died. Goodness me, his name's coming out of my head.
Stephen Hawking.
Hawkins, right. And when I read that book, which was a world bestseller, it sold 10 million copies. It was barely 200 pages long. The first 3 or 4 chapters I could just understand. The last few were very difficult for mugs like me, but it had an enormous impact on explaining clearly how the universe was probably formed, where it was going, etc. And this book I'm just mentioning, Empty Planet, is the 3rd book of a short style that has made me think carefully and contemplate what we are as a human society. The book overwhelmingly provides anecdotal information, but also a lot of research information, that the world's population is not going to increase over the next century from our present barely 7.5 billion to figures more than at the most 8 to 9 billion. And by the end of this century, the world's population will be less than it is now. And they use the figures of looking at the fertility rate of all the countries of the world. Much of it got from the UN and much from other research organizations. They have a figure saying if a country's population is to be maintained at the present level, you need a fertility rate of 2.1%. That means every family relationship should have 2 and a little bit for kids. And then you would maintain and have small growth. Once it drops below 2%, the fertility rate, you start to go into significant population decline. And the fertility rate does include, in the calculation, countries that use immigration to grow their population. And I'll come back to that a bit later. But that figure, 2.1, is immutable in a sense, and all demographers, and these people are demographers, agree on. The UN, up until recently, has been making calculations based on a fertility rate in the world well above 2%. And that's why they talk about a population in the world. It could be as high as 11 billion by the end of the century. And if people got really fertile and had 3 or 4 kids, it could get as high as 15 billion, double the present number. They completely dispatch those figures as unrealistic based on existing fertility rates. And they make a comment that really is profound in one way. They say of all the species on the planet Earth, we are the only species in this century that is going to knowingly take a decision to reduce our numbers in the planet. Other species come and go for other reasons, but we are the only species that knowingly will reduce because we are not reproducing more than 2.1%. So that is a profound statement. And I now want to go, and I've given Peter some couple of slides, you call them, to put up. And I want to go, Peter, if you could put up on the screen the first one with the United Nations population predictions. There it is. And you can see it very quickly. We're at the moment 7.6 billion. They predict on the present figures they're using, which is above 2.1, we'll have 8.6 billion by 2030, 9.8 by 2050, and 11.2 billion by 2100. But then you note this comment: if the fertility rate is less by half a baby than the UN predict, 2050, the world population would be 8.5 billion, and by 2100, it would be down to 7 billion, less than we have at the moment. And they then point out in their book that the first world, there's not one country in the first world that has a fertility rate above 2.1. Most of them are between just over 1 to 1.5 to 1.8. That's all the first world, including Australia, New Zealand, North America, Western Europe, and also Japan is in that category. And they then make these predictions, which says that the first world, our populations will go down. And I just wanted to, the next one I want to put up, Peter, is what is particularly interesting. China and India, who aren't automatically included in first world, but very close. Bring up the one that's got, on present fertility rates, Peter, the China's population in 2030. Can you bring that one up? No, that's not, here we are, yes. In 2030, it will be 1.4 billion, just a bit more than it is now. But by 2100, on the present fertility rates, China will have only 750 million people. That is 700 million or 650 million less than now. And one looks at the development in China when they're infrastructure building, they're going to have masses of empty cities, empty towns. They're going to have freeways and fast trains that won't be full of people because the population is nearly halved. India, at the moment, in 20, will have 1.67 billion because their fertility rate is right on 2.1. But they give a lot of anecdotal evidence and measurement that India will slip under 2% fertility rate, which will mean that their population will drop from, it won't be 1.7 billion, it'll be under that, it will be 1.2 billion, about what it is now. But they say if it drops much further under 2% fertility, it will also start going down. The next one I want you to bring up, Peter, is the one that also has got China talking about 2.1. That's the third. If you can bring that one up, Peter. No, not that one. Yeah, this is, I've talked about India and China. And then you see second world countries. Brazil, in Brazil, the fertility rate is 1.8%, which means declining population. Mexico 2.3, but it's coming down. They're predicting in the next decade or so, it will go below 2.1. Malaysia's right on 2.1, and Thailand is down to 1.5. That fertility rate means their population, which I think now is around 80 million, will start declining. The final one I want you to put up, Peter, is this one about Africa, Middle East. Now, these are present fertility rates in third world countries. Countries overwhelmingly dominated by agriculture as the main source of income. The same in the Middle East, all well above the 2.1. But in every one of these countries, the book shows that these figures have declined from much higher, and they're still declining. And they believe that in the end, these countries, as they have increasing urbanization and education of women, will also drop below the replacement rate. Now this leads us to, in their book, they explain how did this happen, that for the first time in the history of our species, we are now making decisions to actually, which will reduce the numbers of the human race. They say the overwhelming reason is urbanization. Up until 100 years ago, most people in the world lived in agriculture, worked in agriculture in one form or other, mostly subsistence sort of farming. And in those days, with lack of education, particularly for women, the idea that an extra kid on a farm or a present farmer was an extra worker to help grow the crops. But when you go to the city, an extra kid is actually a cost to you because you've got to pay for things. And they connect women and urbanization and education. And they give in the book, in many different countries, anecdotal information. I'll emphasize anecdotal. And I give two particular examples. One is India. They went to a slum in a low-income slum in New Delhi and had organised about 20 women sit around in a circle and via an interpreter discuss family planning, families and what they wanted. One, the women automatically were accepting a lot of state government propaganda talking about the perfect family is mum and dad and 2 kids. And they were by and large accepting that. Secondly, they were finding out that economically it was much better to only have 2 kids than have 6 or 7, could feed 2 better. Thirdly, they got information that their own health was less at risk. They also complained that being the men in there, most of them were arranged marriages, and that their men didn't want to participate much in family planning, like even the use of condoms. But they themselves were making the choices and were choosing to get government provided at a state level sterilisation. The other thing they finished off, and they've said this generally about women in urban areas, even if still not very well educated, they noted that every one of these women sitting around in the circle who were at the bottom of poverty, the most poorest people, each of them had a mobile phone. And during the discussion, they kept looking at their mobile phone. And he said, it's maybe the mobile phone for poor women. They can afford a mobile phone and they get information they've never got before via the mobile phone, and including information about fertility and what they've got, what they can do themselves. The other one was Brazil. Again, high Catholic country, and we said before, a fertility rate now dropping below 2%. And they pointed out, again anecdotally, that in Brazil, there is sort of a national health system whereby if you're having a baby, you get certain assistance from the government for the cost. The doctors know that if they perform a natural birth, the doctor gets a certain payment. But if they perform a cesarean, they get a lot more money from the government to perform the cesarean. So what is happening? Doctors are encouraging women to have a cesarean birth rather than a natural birth, because that's an income issue. But they say to the women, by the way, while they've got you, you might say, opened up or operated on for the cesarean, we can do the fertility, we can give you sterilisation, what do you call the old tie the tubes or something like that, all for the same price. And the women, apparently, without telling their husbands, are having it done. So they go home and the husband, though he still doesn't use a condom, it doesn't matter. And the other thing they said about, they noticed in not only in Brazil, but many of these third world countries, women, once they get to an urban situation, he said they start affording the minimum a television set. And he said, we've discovered that many of them are regular watchers every day of what we would call soapy TV programs. Days of Our Lives or variations thereof, I think they're called. But they said what they've noticed, the women, that in these characters, women are strong personalities, making decisions about how they run their lives, including from time to time telling men no on something. And he said that's another culture that's going on, changing the way women are taking control of their fertility, and as a result, that's why the birth rate is dropping. I'll finish, Peter, on the last comment. They make the countries in the future that will have great success, better success on population numbers to maintain their population are those that have a more open immigration program. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, not so much new, but Australia, Canada, and the USA. The book was only printed last year, so they really point the bone that it's madness of Donald Trump to try and stop immigration. Because he said in those countries where immigrants come in, by and large, they work harder, they are younger and want to make a go, and they provide more impetus in the economy. And they compare it with countries like China, Japan, two examples, and some European countries, where there's an absolute ban on immigration. And the reason Japan is declining for 30 years now is they don't have enough young people in the community, and they don't allow any immigration. They give examples of how difficult it is to go and live in Japan for many years and try to get citizenship. It's almost impossible. The same in China. So they are cutting off sources of new people to make up the difference. And the Japan figure, for example, is quite astonishing in the book. They predict that Japan has 122 million people at the moment. In the next 25 years, their population will drop to 95 million. That is they will lose people as the equivalent of the total existing population of Australia in the next 25 to 30 years. They then raise at the end for contemplation amongst us all, what is it going to do for how we run society, how we measure economic growth, how we are all based on demand, creating so many things, because there are more and more people. When there are less people, we will need less shoes, we will need less clothing, we'll need less cars. It just goes on and on. What do you replace an economic model that is based on the ultimate deflation, which is lack of people? And that's the question that really struck me. I don't have an answer to it. They do point out, as Peter just said in his introduction, about pollution. That one of the things that will occur with a less world population and with increased productivity and technology in agriculture, we will need way less farmland in the world. They predict that large parts of marginal farmland in each country, including Australia, will be able to be released and go back to bush, go back to wilderness. Environmentally, we probably think that's a pretty good idea. But it will also mean whole jobs have gone for it. It will mean regional towns will lose population and will die. So the depopulation in rural, including in Australia, will be one of the outcomes as people move to the city. One of the last comments they made, they interviewed Pat Dobson in writing the book. We all know Pat Dobson is a senator now, leader of the Aboriginal Indigenous community. And he discussed with them his concern that the fertility rate amongst Indigenous people is now way below 2%. And he is makes the point that over the next half century, the Indigenous people's culture will just disappear because there's none left. They've just disappeared. They've not reproduced themselves. The many hundreds of Aboriginal languages will just disappear. And he said that they say the same in indigenous populations, say the Inuit people in Canada, we call them the old days Eskimos, or Indian people, the indigenous people of America. It will happen across the world. And they predict that the 6,000 languages that are in the world at the moment may be down to less than 2,000. And 2 or 3 main languages like English, Spanish, Mandarin will overwhelmingly dominate the world with a less population in urban settlement. Peter, I'll leave it at there. The book, I can only recommend it to you. I got it through, it takes a while, it's got to come from overseas with all the difficulties at the moment, but it is a book that has made me on and off for the last 6 weeks stop and think about the society we're going to have. And tomorrow, on Saturday, I will go to a birthday party for my granddaughter who is 1 year old. In 2100, she'll be 80 years of age. With average luck, she'll still be alive. But she'll be living in a world that has less people by hundreds of millions than we have now. And the economic structure and the structure of society that she'll be living in is hard for me to fathom or imagine. So Peter, on that point, I thank you for having the opportunity, and I again congratulate Rotary on having in this time these Zoom proposals and opportunities. But there it is.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thoughtful and thought-provoking as always, and as always, well-researched. Stephen Haynes has got his hand raised, and I'll get him to ask his question in a minute. But before he does, I just wanted to, I saw Zing smiling and nodding on the way through. And for a researcher, it's interesting, Chris, you mentioned that there isn't any charts in the book.
Yes.
It's a very much a qualitative piece.
Yes.
Seeking people's opinions and feedback.
Yeah, well, when I watched the interview on the internet when they were being interviewed in this forum, they made the point, demography is a very boring subject for most people. And most demographers write reports which have got hundreds of charts in every direction, which he said was a turn up. We decided not to put one chart in. So all the figures I've given you don't come from a chart. They come from within paragraphs they write to explain the figure. And I have to say, it makes it a much easier thing to read and understand that you're not trying to interpret. They interpret the figure in the description. But they made a deliberate choice to make the book more readable to non-demographers in the community. So there's not a chart in it or a diagram at all. It's all descriptive, and they do emphasize the arguments they have, and they disagree with the UN figures on growth very strongly, but they quote many independent research institutes around the world that do deal with this, that they all believe, and they believe in the next 5 years, the UN Population Center, organisation of the UN, will accept that there has now been a dramatic difference in how things are going to be reported and predicted.
Thanks, Chris. Stephen, your question.
Thank you, Chris. When you mentioned this book at the last meeting, I downloaded it and I've read it and I've enjoyed it. It was a very good book. I agree with everything you say about it. I think one of the interesting things for me is what it means for Australia's future migration policy, and I'd be interested in your comments on this as a former government minister. We have seen a situation in Australia where there's been a big fall off in immigration relating to the coronavirus. We like to get back to an immigration figure of a couple of 100,000 a year. It seems to me after reading this book that we're going to all be competing for migrants a lot more than we have been in the past. And I'd be interested in what that means for Australia's policy settings in terms of our migration program and whether that still remains a desirable target.
You know, if despite short-term things like the coronavirus or bushfires, this issue has really got to be examined by all governments, but above all by the community. we have to move away from what this book, if it's correct, and I think it is, that Australia's natural fertility rate without immigration is about 1.5%. So we didn't have immigration. Over a period of time in the future, we'd get to 25, 27 million, and then it starts declining, and we would lose millions of people over the rest of the century. If we have a couple of 150,000 coming in, that makes up the gap. We at least maintain ourselves. But more importantly, we have young people in the immigration target, and the families that are coming, they're energetic, they want to have success, they want to build, create demand. And that really is one of the messages in the book, that you do need immigrants to make up the gap. And in particular, you need young immigrants. They use, as you will have noted, their description of why Japan has been in a recession effectively since 1988-89 for 30 years. And one of the reasons is they have less and less every year young people. They make the point, when was the last time in the last 20 years Japan produced something to the world, a new innovation, a new product? None. And that make this point, that no longer is Japan providing the innovation because there's not enough young people energetically working and thinking of new ideas. They make the point that in the last 30 years, there have been Japanese people with a Japanese background who've won a Nobel Prize for ideas, research, but they don't live in Japan. They live in America, they live somewhere else. So they and because Japan flatly refuses to have an immigration program, they're on this like walking the plank, that though they've already got the oldest age population in the world, that's just going to get older and older, and with less and less young people, not only to pay the taxes for the services, but to have ideas and energy in the economy. And that is a message I hadn't ever got hold of before, of why you need immigration to maintain energy in your economy, ideas, innovation. And that's why they have a real go indirectly at Donald Trump. Because the reason America is a world economy, not just because it's the 320 million, is because they keep bringing in immigrants who add to it. Silicon Valley has got as many Indians in it from India as it has Americans, because they're very good at mathematics, apparently. They bring new people in, put them into what I call, the melting pot. China and Japan don't have a melting pot. They refuse to have one, and both of them, Japan's already on the plank and China is moving that way. The China problem was exacerbated by the one China policy. And they now say you can have 2 kids in China, but they give some evidence that Chinese women are not that keen on having 2 kids. Even though they can now, there's no penalty for having 2 kids. In the old 10 years ago, if you had 2 kids, you got a big fine by the government. Now, even though those fines aren't there, they're still not automatically moving up to have 2 kids to have population at least maintained. So I think we've got to get away from, obviously, the Pauline Hanson lunatic fringe about these people, whether they're Muslims or Christians or not. It doesn't matter. We need the energy of young people. If our population has made a decision that we're only going to have 1.5% natural fertility, we need immigrants to maintain the energy in the Australian economy.
Thanks, Chris. Florine, I think you were a question. You weren't adjusting your camera.
So one of the phenomenon of like change in demography is something that economics and demography has picked up decades ago. The main change in Western countries from like 5 kids to 2 kids was actually in the 19th century. So this happened like by the early 20th century, Western societies were by about 2 kids. And there's a huge debate, it hasn't been fully cleared, whether it's a cultural phenomenon, and we usually blame the French as having started it, that spreads out, or whether it's actually kind of like an economic phenomenon, or whether industrialization and then globalization has something to do with that kind of spread. But just prefacing that, if you look at modern societies, I mean, you mentioned China, but I think South Korea is probably an example people usually use. There's the question, the debate about a demographic dividend. But the question essentially becomes is if you have a substantial drop in your fertility rate, you actually can use that to substantially increase your economic wealth. It's because essentially you have a substantial drop of people that are in the labor force, you have an increase in the relative share of people that are in the labor force. So you have less people that are dependent on other people that are in the labor force. And so there's a debate, it's still, again, it's contested, but there's a huge argument to be made that South Korea got rich because they were able to use that demographic dividend to get rich. China is currently in this process. The people are essentially making an argument that China is essentially trying to grow rich before it grows old. If it can pull it off, then they are essentially in a situation where we are, and this is what you currently have. The huge difference, what you currently have, and again, I'm curious what the people will put in this book, but we essentially have societies that shifts from what you might call labor to capital. We are rich in the sense that Western societies that have made this drop to low kid numbers tend to be rich. And China is trying to do the same thing. It's trying to basically, it did drop the kids, but it tried to become rich. I mean, it's not there yet, it's still a long way to go, but it's getting there. And the consequence of this is that we have societies that look differently in the sense that look with society that's much more capital intensive than we are in earlier terms. Now, the consequence of that is, the practical consequence is probably some interest rates. It will probably mean that like we will have in the future very, very low interest rates because you have a lot of capital. And so I'm curious in the trying sense is like, do these people in the book actually address the question that we are different from early societies, that we are now essentially rich societies where capital plays a much bigger role than it played essentially, kind of say, 200 years ago?
Well, I think that's what you call the description of China, that they're trying to get rich before they run out of people, is one way of putting it. And they are partly succeeding. My own view is, if we can find a way over the next 100 years that we can work out that there is not an economic, lower population, etc., the world's population actually goes down from what it is now by a billion people, that with all the technology advances and qualities, etc., people will still have a good quality of life. If the interest you say about all these countries, about capital, where that's the issue, we've got the capital, but there's so much capital, will interest rates ever go back to 7 or 8 or 10 or 15%? Probably not. And secondly, if it does try to move that way, I suspect governments in the Western world, including the China, they will move to make sure interest rates don't go back up, because the capital is there and they'll work. This is a part of a new system, which is it socialism? Is it capitalism? Or is it just adjusting to something that the Marxists never thought would happen? This incredible wealth that's been created. The issue of distribution is still, equality is still an issue. I agree that China, but if they lose several 100 million people over the next 100 years, there will be adjustment. That a lot of the stuff they've spent their money on infrastructure now will just be sitting idle. There'll be no one driving on, there'll be hardly any cars on the new freeways. They won't be running the same number of fast trains, right? What's the economic outcome? They also know, we also know, and this is why I'm a bit more optimistic to say the least, that we will have new technologies. Robots will do a lot of the dead work at the moment that human beings have to do. I suspect there will be a robot rubbish collection system in the cities, right? And that you won't have to put even your rubbish bin out. There'll be a system where it goes into a pipe or whatever. There will be automatic, robotic cars. Will ultimately, with all the technology. And I heard Jay Weatherall say in a comment 3 years ago when he was talking about this, this is the upside. even though you might have a lot more people in retirement homes, people not well because of their age, at the moment, if you want as a family to take them out, you've got to go there and drive them. And that is, or the nursing home. But if you had self-drive cars, they could get out every day and drive somewhere and see something that stimulates them, gives them, etc., without waiting dependently for someone else to come and drive them. That to me is a real plus of what new technology would do for this much older population, irrespective of people arguing, as I mentioned in this book. Some people say someone born today, the average will be able to live to 130 or 100 like my granddaughter because of changes in and that. But the issue that I don't know enough about is what you have raised. With this massive amounts of capital now in the world, money, and that governments are able, within reason, not to be like Germany in 1924 and print, $400 trillion, and that inflation at 1,000% an hour or something. You can say, and I've read in even the Fin Review recently an article, a person saying, when we have been besotted by debt, government debt, and the large part of the political process is how do we get our debt down? I started to say, we may be too worried about that because we have the money. Final comment on that for Australia. We talk about we've just spent 300 billion in the coronavirus on the debt, of national debt. But no one's mentioned that out on the right-hand side, we have 3 trillion Australian dollars invested in superannuation. That is a wealth in the country, in the macro for it, which I think, again, we are not yet working out how you adjust, and that this issue of debt, though the debt is a concern and is used politically, oh, we're going to be debt, everyone owes $8 billion on each person's body or whatever, those figures that are used to scare people. Well, maybe that is what we used to be. But in the future, with less people in the world, we still have enormous amounts of wealth. But the debt will be able to be handled if the governments of the world know how to do it. I'm not sure. Our political system, if it throws up a Donald Trump every now and again, you've got a problem in a democracy. But you can't have the Chinese system either. Xi Jinping tells everybody what to do and you go and spend money on something that is not needed. I just conclude about China. Since I did the stuff 6 weeks ago, I've consistently gone back and used the good old internet Google and put in such things as, Chinese infrastructure, trains, fast trains, and the stuff that they put, a lot of it made by the Chinese government, so it's partly propaganda. But the amount of stuff they built on 4-lane freeways all over China, on train lines, on ports, on airports, on shipping ports, on container, it is staggering. And you think, do they need all of that in the future with less people? Probably not. So that for infrastructure as a demand will no longer be there, but therefore we can spend it on something else. It's a long answer, and you should criticise me for taking so long, and I'm sorry. But
the honourable member's time has expired.
Yes, but it's a good question, and I think it's something going to have to be debated because the answer is not black and white on it. That's absolutely right.
Absolutely, and I'll take in Q&A terms, I'll take Florian's question as a comment. Steve Larkins, you've got a quick question, I think. Unmute. I'll unmute you. It's all right.
Here we go.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of points that Chris made, and one was in relation to superannuation. I'll just start by saying my brother, who's a financial advisor, told me that for the first time in the history of Australia, we're now a net exporter of capital, and it's all thanks to superannuation. So everyone put that away. That's pretty impressive. The second thing is, I think it's actually time to reset the way we think about economics, because we've had this notion that population equals economic growth. Yep. But there's also a massive cost to sustain it. we were killing the planet. I think this is great news, personally. So while we artificially seem to be making money over here, we're going to have to spend it to save the planet over here. And there's no method of reconciling that just yet. I've travelled a lot in Africa, and when you see a country like Kenya, which at one stage had a population growth rate of 13%, there would be no natural habitat left, and it would be buried in its own rubbish. So I think fantastic. So perhaps what we've got to do is get away from this paradigm of quantity and move to one of quality. And it's certainly doable. The other point I'd make, Chris also raised about China with civil engineering. Any student of history might recall the fact that that's exactly what Japan did as part of its emergence from the Second World War. It invested massively in civil engineering and exported it. It's almost like that's the first stage of that growth trajectory that we're talking about. So perhaps a lot of that is going to become redundant. So I think the challenge is for everyone to actually, how do you make the most of this phenomena? Because it might actually take the imperative out of going to Mars, for example. If we don't bugger this planet up, we won't need to leave it.
Thanks, Steve. Chris?
Yeah, well, I have to say, Steve, I agree that if we have less people on the planet, it means we can all live in a much better environment for ourselves and every other species, fauna, flora, etc. I remember the debate as an example 20 years ago. I was in the Parliament. We were moving to declare Antarctica an absolute natural wilderness of which you cannot go and mine on, you cannot go and develop, etc. And one of the arguments put round, and I was really taken by, was Antarctica is the last continent left that human beings haven't greatly destroyed by shifting down there, mining, etc. And what people said was, in another 100 years, we want our great-great-grandkids to visit and see Antarctica because it's the last wilderness left on a big way on the planet. And that, I think, you got to think is that all the rest of us in large parts of the world, we are not living in the original wilderness of which we emerged. It's all been changed. And I think if a lot of our farming land can go back to being, we don't need it, go back to wilderness, restored, etc., I think that's better for the human race. I agree with Steve that Japan spent squillions of dollars, and when they got into a recession in the 1990s, their immediate response of the Japanese government was to spend more money making more freeways. As someone said, there's not a river that they haven't concreted over or built a concrete embankment on or delivered another freeway to a small city. They just had to they thought this would keep the economy going, but it didn't. The economy has been lethargic for 30 years. These blokes I put in the book, put their finger on it. They don't have the energy in the community of young people enough to really make a difference anymore. And Japan doesn't need any more freeways. I saw the other day, and they're now talking about having a maglev train between Osaka and Tokyo, which travels at 500 mile an hour, when they've got a very fast train that travels at 200 mile an hour or 180 mile an hour. You wonder, is the quality of life in Japan going to improve by a 30% increase in the speed of a fast train between the two biggest cities? They're going to spend $100 billion on building it. You might think, is that $100 billion spent better on social education, on other things about the actual individual living standard? I think that's a question they have to answer, and I think it's a question China. And in Australia, at the moment, there are people rolling around, let's have $100 billion of infrastructure after the coronavirus. I'm not sure that may be automatically to build one of them is to build the train line inland, Brisbane to Melbourne. Is that really going to make much of a change? These are questions that we haven't really answered. We always say, let's build something else. Let's build another dam. Let's build another airport. Let's build another freeway. And yet you're asked the question at the end, what is the social outcome that has improved the living standard in general, not on the ability just to drive a car faster?
Thanks, Chris. We've got a couple of questions, and before we get to those, I just wanted to raise the issue, a lunchtime topic of religion. A few years ago, Frank O'Neill and I were standing in a schoolyard in an island just off Davao in the Philippines, where it was in a strongly Catholic country. There was a lot of young Muslim kiddies going to that elementary school. And Frank, who's a great student of numbers and comes from Ireland, made the observation that there was a really bit of a race between the Roman Catholic Church and the Muslim faith to populate, and them with the largest numbers wins. I noticed on your charts, a lot of the countries that are still having increased birth rates apparently appear to be Muslim countries, and yet those with declining birth rates are Roman Catholic countries. Does the book
Yep.
make any reference to religion?
It does, and they make the reason that women are taking control of their fertility, are really making the difference, is because the weakening of religion in terms of education, in terms of information to people. When people were isolated in a rural village, it was very easy to control views, etc. I think they make a cryptic comment about that the churches, or not churches, the religions of the world originally have been run and devised and written about by men. Women are not equal in the organisation of world major religions. And what is happening is that women are now starting to realise they don't have to always listen to the men who run the religions, etc. On the terms of Muslim, when I talked about that Indian round table discussion with very poor women, a third of the women sitting around were Muslim women, and they had exactly the same attitude as the Hindu women sitting around in the circle about taking control of their fertility and ignoring what their men want. We talk about the Philippines, by the way. In the book, I think the fertility rate in the Philippines is down to about 1.4, 1.3. They will have if it stays at that level, they will have significant population decline through the rest of this century. And that is a major Catholic country with a significant Muslim minority in the south. So they make the point that this decline in population is across all religions because women are no longer allowing men who run the religions to tell them what to do about their fertility. If they can get the slightest chance to take control of their fertility, they will. The example in Brazil, 95% Catholic country, and whatever the church is saying or whatever, women are making their own choice for fertility control and then accepting sterilisation by their private doctor so they don't have any more kids. Well, that is completely contrary, as I understand it, to what a lot of religions say women should be doing.
Yeah. Second last question, Chris, comes from the President.
Yes, Chris. My question is, does the book talk about the impact that demographic growth based on immigration will have on the culture, religion, as it came up now, and the lifestyle, above all, of our countries? And what is your personal view beside the book view, if there was one?
Well, let me first declare I'm a non-religious person. I'm basically an atheist. I've come to that. So first of all, those of you who might disagree, I admit that I am a non-religious person. I hold positions in the secular lobby group of Australia, in the humanist groups, etc., which are opposed to all religions, not just Christian, all religions, etc. So with that declaration of conflict of interest, the book is at times quite pointed in a nice way that religion is declining in many ways in the world, not just Christian, but because of improved education. And because you see so much in our daily life in Australia, religion is everywhere. There's churches on the street corner. There are, you know, people debating and talking. And there are priests and people go to church every Sunday, or when the Muslims go or the Hindus go. It's all there. But what is going on below that so-called present formal level in the community, underneath, education in different ways is changing what those religions are. And they make the point that one of the reasons that in Ireland, their fertility rate has plummeted is because the demise of the Catholic Church's influence in the Republic of Ireland over the last 30 years, because of the scandals that have kept hitting the Catholic Church on abuses issues, sexual harassment, pedophile, etc. So what happened in the last 10 years? Despite being nominally a Catholic country, they have voted in a referendum for very liberal divorce law, same-sex marriage, and abortion. Abortion was written into the Constitution of Ireland as being absolutely forbidden. So they had to have a referendum. And they got over 65% of the vote. And that means a lot of Catholic people, of course, voted to allow the availability of abortion. That is to me a sign. Ireland's a small country, but underneath, they say in the book, it comes up again and again, that access to information, once people go sideways and don't automatically get it from the top down in a small structured village, in a rural background, you're into urbanisation, there are so many other points of reference going on that it undermines not just, let me say, religion, it is undermining political parties. The Labor Party is not the same as it was 50 years ago, because even amongst our members, and I'm still a member of the party, there is much more divergent opinion about what we should be doing, because all these other sources of information are coming in. And it's the same in the Liberal Party. You've got people further to the right and further to the left. But the book in its own way, as a non-religious person, I'm somewhat encouraged, not so much because of the population number, the fact that more and more people in the world, particularly in the third world, are now making judgments that they don't automatically accept what a priest or a mullah or a religious leader says above them.
Thanks, Chris. We're almost out of time, but a very quick response, if you could, to a comment or a question that David Egan's posed in the 8 weeks or 7 weeks since you spoke to us. Given the events of the last couple of weeks in China, as a former politician, a human rights advocate, and some knowledge of trade, any quick comment on what's happening?
Yes, I think the Australian government was completely ham-fisted in what it did to put the boot into China about Wuhan and about hiding it or whatever. What they should have done is, now 90 countries have asked for an independent review of the coronavirus. And Xi Jinping has even said yes, said once it's all over, we should have an independent review. And that review talked about where it started and how it affected all the countries of the world, etc. All Australia, instead of going, and my concern was, one, Donald Trump said it one day and we said it the next. One thing that will send the Chinese off their, very agitated, is that we're seen as doing nothing more than Donald Trump's as a deputy sheriff in the Pacific. That is very damaging, and always has been. We can be the friends with America, have all those, the Anzac Treaty, etc. Chinese will accept that, but they don't want to see that whatever an American president says, we then follow the next day, the next week. If we had gone privately around the world, behind, not publicly, and spoke to those 90 odd countries, why don't we all get together and issue a joint statement for 90 countries to say, China, we want an investigation, and it will include what happened in Wuhan. It will include that. It will include how all the countries responded. So China's not just being picked out. The Chinese might not have liked it, but they couldn't have done anything about it. They could then not have picked. I see this morning, I knew this, I thought this was the case, but now it's been out. China and US have signed a new trade deal. And one of the parts of the deal was that China would buy a lot more agricultural product from the US. They've just knocked us off on barley. And guess who they're going to buy the barley from now? The USA. Barley farmers in the USA will pick up what they've knocked us off.
Heavily subsidised barley farmers.
Yes, our barley farmers aren't subsidised. The last thing I would say is I used to be for 3 years the Minister for the Anti-Dumping Authority of Australia. So I've had some experience about anti-dumping. And Australia has been a vigorous user of anti-dumping processes against a whole range of countries every year and companies. We have to stop cheaper imports coming into Australia because it could affect our industry. We put 145% tariff on steel from China in 2014 to save Whyalla and Kembla Steelworks. The Chinese said, hang on, we're spending $40 billion a year buying iron ore from Australia, and you put 145% tariff on us selling a couple of million tons of steel into Australia. They just saw that as double speak. So the issue is on anti-dumping. Australia, in one sense, we have been very vigorous. China is doing to us on anti-dumping what we have done to them. I've come to the conclusion that maybe anti-dumping should be abolished as a process under the World Trade Organization. But when I criticise the federal government, I have to say I criticise the Labor Party, because 2 weeks ago we agreed with the attack on China over Wuhan, etc. That was Penny Wong's statement. I think it was ham-fisted. I think it gave the wrong message from both political parties. You don't have to kowtow to China, but you do it as an independent country, saying this is our view. We don't care what Donald Trump says or Merkel says or whatever in the world. We keep saying this is our interest. For example, we should never send the South China Sea. The Americans keep asking us to join them in sending the American 7th Fleet through the South China Sea. We should go through the South China Sea as a point that is international waterway, not controlled by China, but we do it ourselves, not connected to an American 7th Fleet, because that is extremely provocative, and it looks like we're doing whatever Donald Trump or an American president asks us. That is not in the best interest of Australia. One last thing on this, I'll just finish on. People keep saying, let's cut China. And Birmingham said the other day, we should find new markets. What? We sold $120 billion worth of stuff to China last year. We have enormous trade surplus with China. Can anyone tell me in the world where we're going to find another $120 billion market for all the stuff we produce? It's impossible. Impossible, and it's stupid to say it. And the Chinese know it's stupid to say. They just think we look like a bunch of dumb clucks. Sorry to end on that word.
That's all right, Chris. Thank you. Darcy Walsh has got a comment, or question, but I'll email that to you and you can take it offline.
And by the way, if you want to give people my email address or my telephone number, Peter, please do so.
I'd love to, and I'll do that, Chris. We're over time, but I don't think anybody's particularly worried. We've still got most of our participants online. Chris, thank you. You've already got a certificate of appreciation, so you're not getting another one. But I'd like to advise you that a further donation we made in your name to eradicate polio in the world.
Thank you. That's very good.
So all that remains as we hand back to President Adri is for members and guests to thank Chris in the usual way.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Over to you, Adri.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much, Chris, and lovely to have you back as a guest speaker, but also as a guest anytime you like for this for our lunches, whether they are online, virtual, or in real life once we will resume. A special thank you also to all our guests today and all our members who are supporting, obviously, our online format of meeting. We hope to see you again next week. Next week, we'll be back here for a special online Zoom meeting for Zone 1 clubs plus guests. Our guest speaker will be General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove. His topic will be leadership in challenging times. As I said earlier, registration on Zoom is required to obtain the link and login details for meeting. All the information for this is on our website under the event booking section. I will now close today's meeting. Thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. I will also now set up the breakout rooms. Have a lovely week.